Thanks, Shani. All right. Welcome, everyone. So, as Shani said, this is our fifth and final one for this round. I just want to thank everybody again for responding to that survey after previous weeks. And the feedback we've gotten has been very helpful. And so I hope we get more of that. And maybe we can do more of these webinars in the future. But to get us started today, our first speaker is going to be Matthew Rigge from our Earth Resources Observation Science Center. And today, Matthew's going to be giving us an update on RCMAP vegetation trends. And this is a spatial data set a lot of folks are familiar with. So, Matthew, I can see your slides.
All right, good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. The floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Leaf. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. Today I'm going to go over some updates with RCMAP and with a special attention on trends that we're seeing in the data. Before I start, I want to thank our tireless colleagues that are instrumental to implementing RCMAP, Corey, Postman, Brett Bundy here at AROS. Also like to thank the BLM, Wildlife, and AIM programs for financial support in addition to WLCI and the USGS and LI program.
Slide.
Okay, so RCMAP uses a combination of field observations and Landsat imagery to produce a time series of fractional vegetation components for 10 components, bare ground, herbaceous, tree, etc., all the way across the Landsat archive stretching back to 1985. So information like this is useful to capturing both gradual and abrupt changes in vegetation condition, and useful for a variety of management applications, monitoring previous vegetation composition, evaluating efficacy of management practices, etc. In the new generation of RCMAP, which we're going to release next week, we have added new training data. We have improved our process by removing a change detection methodology, which will allow our products to fluctuate more through time, expanded our mapping area to the Great Plains, enhanced our AI methodology, and added a couple new independent variables to our model. So this is what our new study area looks like. This is expanding to include the Central Grasslands Roadmap area, which will allow users to apply a convergence of evidence approach. So additional data is always good to reduce uncertainty in any analysis. Here's an overview of what those products look like. This is a 2024 map. And really the most interesting thing is when you start looking at temporal patterns. And I'm going to focus on that for a few minutes here. So this is by level 3 ecoregion. We evaluated the Thiel-Sand slope per ecoregion of all of our components. So we've got ecoregions colored in blue that are showing a net decline in that component from 85 through 2024. And red, we have an increase in that component in that ecoregion. So the big stories here are obviously the increase in annual herbaceous cover that everyone's aware of. But often what happens is the annual herbaceous cover ends up coinciding with a decreasing trend in bare ground in those same ecoregions. The other big story is the increasing trend in tree cover across the Great Plains, and reducing the herbaceous cover in that region as well, which is a well-documented phenomenon. Okay, looking at accuracy assessments. So RAP and us, RAP, the Rangeland analysis platform, have agreed to set aside a pool of 6,000 odd AIM points, a 5% random withholding from each year AIM data were collected. So we've got a spatial and temporal withholding of the AIM data. The take-home message here is this new generation of data is approximately 15% better in terms of R squared and 15% better less or 15% less RMSE compared to our prior generation. So the biggest improvements are in sagebrush and shrub. And that has to do with our inclusion of a convolutional element in our mapping. So we're basically leveraging texture information and information from adjacent pixels to improve accuracy. Another cool thing we've done is we can now break down accuracy by ecoregion. So this is looking at that same pool of 6,000 withheld aim points. And we can look at the level 3 ecoregion. In this case, that's a typo. That's a R, not an R squared. So the correlation coefficients for each component by ecoregion. So that's one big focus we've had over the last couple years is better communicating error to our users and helping users understand how to best apply data like ours to decision making. And we've been working a lot with RAP to come up with some documentation and journal articles to communicate these things. So a lot of the information is sort of boilerplate statistics. This is like for example, the previous slide, that's across the entire study area. It really is more relevant to look at ecoregion specific stats because we can see the variation. So for example, I'll pick on tree cover. We don't have a lot of trees in the Chihuahuan Desert over in New Mexico and Texas, so the accuracy suffers there. In regions where we have more tree cover, the accuracy tends to be better. So along that same vein, we've done a lot of analysis on how error scales as a function of level of spatial aggregation. So we've got a new paper out in Rangeland Ecology and Management that specifically looked at this. We had a really unique data set. All of our high resolution training sites for RCMAP. So that's like a series of 350 10 by 10 kilometer sites where we had predictions of all of our components, and we compared that to our Landsat scale, our regional predictions. And the take-home message there is that error obviously increases at bigger or at finer spatial scale. That's a pretty no-duh kind of statement. But there are mathematical functions that drive this. So even going from a single 30-meter pixel to a group of 3 pixels, so a total of 9 pixels or a 90 by 90 meter area, you increase accuracy substantially, and that sort of plateaus off at around a 200 to 300 meter level of aggregation. And that will vary by component, that will vary by ecoregion, etc. But this sort of scaling, I think, is really useful to a lot of users. Looking at that a little bit more in depth, like I mentioned, that scaling improvement varies by ecoregion, it varies by component. So we kind of put together a map of what the optimal scale is to look at the components per ecoregion. And yeah, that I think is really useful. We've heard a lot of feedback from users, and RAP has as well. Common misconceptions, like for example, you shouldn't look at data like ours at a scale less than 500,000 acres or some other really large scale. And the data that we have just shows that's not really the case. We did a similar analysis with sage steppe observations, finding the same kind of result, that accuracy increases as you look at bigger and bigger levels of aggregation. Also, accuracy increases when in sage steppe there's a number of different treatments. There's mowing treatments, burning treatments, mechanical treatments, etc. And the common theme is the bigger the effect that treatment had on the landscape, the more accurate the RCMAP data was. We've been working together with the BLM to increase the usability of the data. So one tool we've been working on is multidimensional. So that allows users to go into RCMAP or Arc Pro, I guess, at this point, and create all sorts of time series plots such as this really easily. All the data is embedded into a single layer. So there's no more wrangling around with hundreds of different layers. All the components, all the years are baked into one layer. So BLM and us have really pushed this, and I think there'll be more coming out on this year. BLM has got a number of new reporting tools looking at plotting trends in allotments through time. It's really powerful tools here. And how has RCMAP been used? I mean, I've got a number of use cases here. Can't go through all of them. I mean, there's a whole host of different things that it can be used for or could be used for, and I think we're just scratching the surface at this point. Looking ahead, we keep on chipping away at error. I mentioned that 15% reduction in independent error relative to our previous iteration. We're doing some work with evaluating hyperspectral data to further improve error. We've got a paper out last year on that. So this emit hyperspectral data has got like 300 spectral bands compared to 6 that we use from Landsat. And we showed a pretty dramatic improvement in accuracy using hyperspectral data. And I mentioned this community of practice. So that's the joint effort with RCMAP and RAP and BLM for that matter on helping users better access, analyze, and interpret data. And I will leave it there.
Is Martin Holdredge, an ecologist from our Southwest Biological Science Center. And today, Martin's going to be talking to us about integrating climate along with sagebrush ecological integrity and R&R and some other land uses. So now, Martin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Leif. Yeah, as Leif mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a couple of related projects focusing on climate change in sagebrush systems. I want to start out by just thanking our funding sources, the Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, and USGS Land Management Research Program, and also thank a lot of contributors who've been involved with this research that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be discussing 4 projects. The first 2 are done, and I'll be showing data for those, and then there's 2 additional projects that we're kind of starting on that I won't be showing any results on, but we'll just briefly be describing. So first project is looking at resistance and resilience, responses to climate change. The second is sagebrush ecological integrity, responses to climate change. Third is combining those 2 data sets to see what additional things can be learned from that. And lastly, looking at kind of grazing and disturbance in the context of climate. I'm going to be very brief on the methods today, but just want to give you kind of a general sense of the framework that we're working with. So one thing we have is a soil moisture model. And so that's taking weather information, soil information, and plant information to then simulate the amount of water that's available in the soil for plants on a daily basis. So that information is going to be going into metrics for R&R, resistance and resilience, I'll be talking about shortly. We've also got a plant community model that couples to the soil moisture. So it's taking, based on the amount of soil water that's available, it's then simulating plant growth, as well as disturbance, such as feedbacks between vegetation and fire, which will become important for some of the other results I'll be talking about, and grazing as well, meaning biomass removal in the model. So Gene Chambers has been working on research for some time now, looking at kind of the ecological resistance to invasion and resilience to disturbance. And Daniel Schlapfer, in collaboration with Gene and others, worked on developing some new kind of climate relevant indicators of resistance and resilience based on that soil moisture model that I mentioned. And the point here being that you can then have indicators for resistance and resilience that are not fixed for a location, but are able to change through time as climate changes. And this map here on the left is showing in red areas that have low resilience, and then the cooler colors are showing areas with moderate to higher resilience. And this map here is then showing projected change for one scenario as an example, one climate scenario as an example. And in gray, you're seeing places where there's not a projected change in resilience. But a lot of those are actually places that are currently low resistance and resilience. And so those changes don't necessarily mean, stability for sure. It just means, that's the lowest category that it can go. And then if you look at, for example, like Wyoming, there are a lot of places that are currently moderate. And there you're seeing declines in resilience. So broadly, what this is suggesting is that climate change is amplifying the current restoration challenges that we have in the sagebrush region. We've also been involved with the sagebrush conservation design. A lot of you are probably familiar with this map here on the left showing sagebrush ecological integrity categories. And recently there was also a special issue in Rangeland Ecology and Management that includes like 20 or so papers that have continued this work and kind of expanded it in multiple different directions. And the part that we've been most involved with is trying to understand how sagebrush ecological integrity might change with climate change. Here we're showing projected changes in SEI. So in reds, you're seeing places that are in the light red, for example, you're seeing a place that's currently core sagebrush, but we're projecting a decline in the future due to declines in climate suitability. Broadly, what we found is that approximately 2/3 of core sagebrush areas, or areas that are currently core sagebrush, so the most intact, are likely to remain climatically suitable in the future under climate change. And then places where we are projecting losses, those losses are mainly due to us simulating less sagebrush in the future or more annuals. And also this map here is kind of just an illustration of one climate scenario, but we had generally, quite a bit of variability among different climate futures, but the overall patterns and general trends were consistent. And we're also now in the early stages of another project that's now trying to combine these two different data sets. And this is kind of a conceptual diagram showing what we're hoping to be able to learn by combining them. So on the vertical axis here, we're showing the future resistance and resilience category, and the top, the future sagebrush ecological integrity category. So this kind of space shows like some potential different places on the landscape. And so if you were in the top left, for example, you'd be in a place that's projected to be a core sagebrush area and also have high R&R. So a place where you'd likely want to consider resisting ecological change. There's a lot of potential there. The top right is a little more complicated. So it's a place that's potentially degraded, but may have higher R&R in the future. And so there may be potential for restoration to be quite successful. The bottom right-hand corner might be an area that's currently or degraded and likely to get hotter and drier, for example, in the future. So may need to consider accepting or directing ecological change in a place like that. And then the bottom left is also a little different. So that's a place that's maybe an intact ecosystem with important ecosystem components, perennials, sagebrush cover, but low resistance or resilience. So protecting that place like that from disturbance would be important, because if you lose it, you're not going to get it back easily. And then lastly, touching on our grazing work, one project we're doing is focusing on the question of trying to answer how the sustainability of grazing might change with climate change, and the related question of whether mitigating or changing the grazing intensity can mitigate kind of climate caused changes to the vegetation and also mitigate changes in wildfire. And we're addressing those questions through the modeling framework I described earlier. And additionally, our collaborator Kyle Palmquist is leading a project looking at targeted grazing of cheatgrass and annuals more broadly. And she's pulling together research from existing studies of targeted grazing on cheatgrass, and then going to use that in concert with the modeling framework to try to understand whether targeted grazing can help mitigate the cheatgrass fire cycle in the future under climate change. So kind of to summarize this work, we're creating products that we're hoping can help prioritize conservation and restoration across the region. So for example, helping think about where to prioritize defending and growing core sagebrush areas, these areas that are currently in good shape and likely to be climatically suitable in the future, potentially good trajectories of R&R, while also considering that other places we may need to think about accepting or directing ecological change. These are potentially degraded areas likely to get hotter and drier in the future and have low R&R. And lastly, I want to just highlight some resources that are available. So the first two projects that I talked about, we've got manuscripts and data releases available. And also we've got some Google Earth Engine web applications where you can visualize some of these layers that I showed you, and additional ones as well, and multiple different climate scenarios to kind of see some climate uncertainty as well, and potentially zoom in more on your area of interest. Thanks.
Next, we've got Shawn O'Neil from our Western Ecological Research Center. And today, Shawn is going to talk to us about the influence of some of those future climate scenarios that Martin just talked about, and what is their impact or influence on habitat and population dynamics for sage-grouse. So, Shawn, I can see your slides.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can see your face. I can hear your voice. The floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm going to be talking about sage-grouse in the context of future climate today. So yeah, I first want to thank our partners on this project. This is supported primarily by Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we also received other critical forms of support along the way. And I'd like to thank all those contributors who helped make the work possible. The long list of co-authors on the first page, really a collaborative effort. It's been great working with all these folks. So first, this project's objectives are listed here. First, we've been looking at variation in sage-grouse demographics, abundance, and population rates of change in response to patterns of precipitation, drought, and changes to vegetation communities. And the majority of that work was specific to the Great Basin, is kind of currently in review. The second bullet here is the phase that we're currently putting the most work into, and that's to identify spatially explicit long-term projections of sage-grouse population size under future climate scenarios described by IPCC. And then we have a working group going where we're looking at modeling frameworks that identify these long-term projected changes and potential losses of sage-grouse habitat. And so that's kind of merging several different efforts coming from different labs within USGS to try to put all these things together and see what it looks like for sage-grouse long-term. And so that phase 2 at the bottom is kind of how we maybe put together the information that we're getting out of phase 1 and couple that with projections of habitat change that might be anticipated from climate change. So to kind of reiterate, this phase 1 is more about the direct weather and climate effects on the bird. And the phase 2 is bringing in like what the changes in habitat might interact with those direct changes, or basically have independent effects. So I'm mainly going to be talking about the phase 1 objective, because that's where we currently have some results coming out. We know that North America and the lower US are going to be experiencing higher temperatures over the next century. This is going to be pretty widespread, occurring under virtually every global climate model. At the same time, much of the country is expected to receive more precipitation, especially in fall and winter. And so I don't necessarily have time to talk through each of the potential mechanisms that's kind of described in that top image there, but I think it's worth keeping in mind that the context we're working under is that climate change can affect any particular species positively or negatively, and there's a variety of mechanisms through which that can happen. And all these relationships and pathways are very complex. So when we're looking at these results, you just got to keep in mind we're pretty certain that we can be uncertain about what's actually going to happen in the future. So the project I'm talking about today, again, centered on the greater sage-grouse. I'll assume some familiarity in the audience with the sage-grouse. It's an indicator species. It has strong relevance to land management policy across the West. A couple of points I would like to make here is that first, clearly we see this long history of population decline in sage-grouse. There are real concerns that those declines will continue. Secondly, the modeling that I'm going to talk about is an extension of the modeling described in the Coates and Prohaska and co-authors, their series of reports that have been coming out over the years on sage-grouse trends and hierarchical modeling to support a targeted annual warning system. Our model structure in this project is similar, but we have added components to more directly model those environmental and climate effects. So previous studies have identified relationships between weather and population trends, depending on where and how a study occurred. Much of the sage-grouse distribution is within this relatively arid, drought-prone environment. And so we kind of assume when we go into these modeling efforts that we're probably going to see stronger signals between fluctuations in moisture and subsequent population responses as more moisture is generally tied to sagebrush understory vegetation productivity, insect abundance, other resources that contribute positively to nesting and brood-rearing success that ultimately lead to recruitment into the population. So as you increase in aridity, you may start seeing these stronger relationships. As you're lower on that aridity gradient, these relationships might be a little more unclear. So briefly on methods, feel free to reach out for more detail if you're interested. We're using the range-wide standardized let count database in our population models subset to years 1992 to 2023 currently. The study area is the entire sage-grouse range. We're using a hierarchical population state space model. We're fitting climate metrics from GridMet and some other environmental covariates to annual sage-grouse population growth. And then we're using downscaled global climate model data to project population growth or decline into the future under 8 different climate models and 2 different emission scenarios. So 16 total models that we're working with there. When we look at the climate projections averaged across the entire sagebrush ecosystem, we can see a couple of patterns here. First, on average, there's hotter and drier growing season conditions expected, and this is represented pretty well by the vapor pressure deficit index, or VPD, and that's the difference between the amount of moisture in the air and the maximum amount of moisture the air can hold at a particular temperature. So higher values are hotter and drier. Secondly, across the board, annual precipitation doesn't show a significant change. Winter precipitation might increase slightly, but when we look at maps of this stuff, we know that's spatially variable. So we initially conducted some exploratory analysis to look at relationships between sage-grouse population growth and VPD depending on time of year. This was done to help inform a set of candidate models that would effectively characterize the relationship between sage-grouse and climate metrics. Sage-grouse population growth was generally negatively associated with VPD, but the strongest relationship spanned some longer time periods that included summer, likely capturing both length and severity of the growing season, drought conditions. We did the same thing for precipitation. These analyses showed generally weaker relationships. The most positive responses we see for summer and the overall growing season precipitation. And we're also exploring responses to a collection of drought metrics that may have more direct ecological relevance. And so the Dryland Eco-Hydrology Lab, we just heard from Martin in the previous talk. This is a group out of Southwest Biological Science Center paired with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. They're working to produce historical data and simulate downscaled projections at the same monthly time step as the other data that we've been using. We've been looking primarily at VPD and precipitation. So if we can bring in some of these other metrics, we have seen some evidence that they'd likely be useful for explaining and predicting sage-grouse population change, especially if we can characterize those across the same seasons. So here's some results from one of our current candidate top models. We accounted for several other environmental covariates when modeling these climate effects, which mostly tracked with our expectations. The model tested overall effects of prior growing season VPD in the same model as prior winter precipitation, and we have an interaction between the two. The results are suggesting a strong negative relationship between growing season VPD and sage-grouse population growth. Winter precip also overall had a negative effect, but the interaction was positive, so there's potentially some offset that winter precip could have, but probably isn't much of an effect there overall. Thinking about how this might affect future sage-grouse populations, this is the average climate model projection of VPD for 2022 to 2032, clipped to sage-grouse current distribution. This is the projection by end of century, and then here's the difference between the two. So the darker colors on the map show the largest projected change. And notably, central eastern Montana, northern Wyoming, you see some of the most dramatic changes in those parts, and it's not just in the southern regions. This is winter precipitation. We see potentially more winter precipitation, especially at higher elevations, but this could be more rainfall as opposed to snow, so that has effects on spring snowpack. Could it influence how quickly soil dries out during subsequent seasonal drought? More to look into there. And then not represented in our modeling yet, but I thought it noteworthy that this is spring precipitation. Now we see even a different pattern here. So as sort of a northeast gradient with potentially more spring precipitation and a southwest gradient with potentially less spring precipitation. So something we want to continue to explore. And now just putting everything together, our models are showing negative effects of increased aridity and extreme drought on sage-grouse populations. We simulated the probabilities that the leks in our model would be extirpated by the end of century under a couple of assumptions. The first one is that VPD increases over time based on projections from the 16 different GCMs. The second one is no change in VPD from current long-term average. And the results show on average 36% of leks were projected to be extirpated by 2100 under the climate change model. That number stabilizes at just 7% under the constant climate projection. We can look at this spatially and project where models or losses might be greatest under these model assumptions. Upper left is lek loss under constant climate, upper right is under climate change scenario, and then the middle is the difference between the two. And so we see kind of, for the most part, that highest extirpation rate is where VPD is likely to increase the most. So I want to talk a bit about management implications. I think it's useful to tie this back to concepts of sagebrush ecological integrity that were brought up in the previous talk and have been circulating as part of the sagebrush conservation design strategy for a few years now. One of the main motivations for the SCD is to provide a framework to help guide the allocation of limited resources that are needed to help conserve sagebrush ecosystems. Under this framework, that concept of defending and growing the core implies that there are some areas where conservation resources and actions are going to be more effective than others, often depending on how degraded a particular area already is. So these concepts can also be applied to sage-grouse conservation. And we've seen some of the stuff that Martin showed us, where you see predictions of soil moisture availability combined with global climate models to produce future ecological integrity classifications. This type of information can facilitate risk analysis of priority targets for sagebrush conservation efforts and where risk might be higher or lower when considering climate change. A benefit of having that information is that when thinking about on-the-ground management, we generally can't control the weather. So when climate changes are driven more or less by climate, that might be a key consideration for whether or not to implement action on the ground. And so we can provide similar high resolution information for sage-grouse based on climate projections, and that helps to identify the odds that direct management actions may or may not alter the trajectory of a certain population or subpopulation. So here's a list of current products and deliverables. There are certainly more on the way. With that, I think I'm probably past time here, so I'll wrap it up. Check out the project webpage if you get a chance, and that's all I got. Thank you.
Our next presentation is going to be a tag team. So we've got Gregor Siegmund and Alice Stears from the Southwest Biological Science Center. And today they're going to be talking to us about understanding, forecasting environmental controls over plant establishment in sagebrush ecosystems. So Gregor, I can see your slides, but they're not yet in presentation mode. Slides look good.
And you can hear me?
I can hear you now. I can see your face. Floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Hi, my name is Gregor Siegmund, and I'm here with Alice Stears, representing a larger project team of collaborators from the US Geological Survey, Northern Arizona University, Boise State University, and the Bureau of Land Management. So our project is focused on understanding and forecasting environmental controls over plant establishment in sagebrush ecosystems to enhance restoration success. Today, we're going to give you a high-level perspective on what motivates our work, provide a quick look into the advances that we're currently making, and share some products that you can either access right now or are coming soon. The work that we do is supported by the Bureau of Land Management, who have been excellent project partners, and is being carried out by the great team that I introduced on the previous slide. I want to say a couple more words about the BLM here, because in addition to providing funding, we've had the opportunity to work closely with them to make sure our science aligns with the agency's needs. So for example, we've been able to brief our partners in person at the National Interagency Fire Center. We also have been fortunate to have Jake Ferguson, Peggy Olwell, and Gina Zwang from the BLM as co-authors on a scientific manuscript. The challenge that we're addressing with this project is one that I imagine people on this call are very familiar with. Sagebrush ecosystems that burn in large wildland fires are at risk of ecosystem transformation, and some of these photos are highlighting that. So these changes may include vegetation shifts from sagebrush and perennial grasses to annual grasses, impacts to wildlife and ecosystems, and changes to fire regimes. Seeding treatments are one of the major tools in the land manager's toolbox that can help direct post-fire recovery. In sagebrush ecosystems, these are large operations that involve a variety of challenges, including capacity and funding, logistics, and decisions about when, where, and what to seed. I'm now going to hand it off to Alice, who's going to talk about our project's goals and how we're making progress and contributing to addressing these challenges.
Thanks, Gregor. So the overarching goal of this project is to develop near-term site-specific forecasts of the germination and establishment of shrub, grass, and forb species that are commonly used in restoration. These forecasts will provide information about the potential impact of near-term abiotic conditions on restoration seedings, which will support managers in their decisions about when and where to implement those seedings. Next slide, please. So we think of this forecasting effort as cyclical, where the three components of forecasting development laid out here, forecast delivery, restoration planning, and forecast development, are iteratively feeding into and improving upon one another. I'm going to talk a bit about the process that we use to develop and deliver these forecasts currently, as well as updates to this process that will generate spatial forecasts. Gregor is also going to share about his work to develop models that predict establishment of common restoration grass species, which will then be incorporated into this forecast process. Some other ongoing programs and projects related to this broader forecasting initiative include the BLM emergency stabilization and rehabilitation and plant conservation and restoration programs, work by Lee Benyon and Allison Simler-Williamson at Boise State University to improve the models that we use to forecast sagebrush establishment, and then ongoing work by Michelle Jeffries and other folks at the USGS Forest and Range Ecosystem Science Center to disseminate these forecasts via a free and widely available web-based tool. Next slide. So keep this sort of methodological overview pretty high level, but I'm happy to chat at any point if anyone has questions about the details. But the overall approach we use to generate the forecasts First relies on long lead forecasts of meteorological information from the National Weather Service Climate Prediction Center. And so these forecasts predict precipitation and temperature over the next 12 months for 102 regions across the continental US. And we go through a process to make these forecasts, to downscale them to a 4-kilometer grid across the Western US to make them site specific. And then we feed these site-specific meteorological forecasts into Soil Lot 2, a process-based model of soil moisture, and then we get forecasts of temperature, precipitation, and soil moisture, including uncertainty over the next 12 months at a site. And then we feed these abiotic forecasts into statistical models to predict the establishment of restoration plant species. So currently, the results from a version of this forecast process are live online as part of the land treatment exploration tool. Users can select a location anywhere in the Western continental United States, and the tool will generate temporal forecasts of temperature, precip, soil moisture for the next 12 months with uncertainty, and then also display the probability of germination and establishment for big sagebrush. And so we are currently working on updating this this process to provide, in addition to these temporal forecasts of abiotic conditions and ecological impacts over the next 12 months, also providing maps of these forecasted values, which will give information about the spatial variability in these values. And we're also working to ultimately predict germination and establishment of additional common restoration grass species, which Gregor is going to talk more about now.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, so in addition to the work that Alice discussed, I'm focusing on adding to our capacity to forecast establishment for other species that are commonly used in post-fire seedings in sagebrush ecosystems. So specifically, I'm focused on 6 perennial grass species: sandberg bluegrass, squirreltail, Indian ricegrass, bluebunch wheatgrass, Snake River wheatgrass, and crested wheatgrass. And for each of these species, we've identified 150 to 300 seedings that span collectively over 30 years and extend across sagebrush ecosystems. These are seedings that have survey data that we can then use to infer seeding outcomes. So these plots here show sort of the amount of data that we have across time and over space. I'm using seedings that we identified from the Land Treatment Digital Library and fire perimeter data, as well as surveys conducted by landscape monitoring programs like the Bureau of Land Management's Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring Program. And I'm happy to chat more about this process and the data if anyone has questions. So very briefly, just to understand the environmental drivers of establishment, essentially what promotes and constrains establishment from seed. We're using this data in combination with a variety of simulation and computational methods, some of which you've heard about in earlier talks, like Soil Wat 2, the soil water balance model. And the end product of this will be both the underlying data as well as models for establishment that can be used to predict establishment from a seeding as a function of the short-term weather forecasts that Alice discussed earlier. So to wrap up, I just want to give you an overview of some project products. We have a couple of papers that are currently in progress, one of which is in review and one in preparation for submission this spring. We're also expecting to share data associated with the second paper via data release. You can also access the land treatment exploration tool to learn more about how you can leverage this decision support tool in your own management and work. And then we also have some fact sheets and a project website that we will share. So I think Alice is putting these in the chat right now. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time and encourage you to reach out to Alice or me with questions and suggestions about how this can support your work. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Alice. Thank you, Gregor. Great talk. Another great example of integrating all these different tools and data together. So appreciate that. Okay. Speaking of integrating tools and data, our next speaker is Mike Duniway, also from the Southwest Biological Science Center. And today, Mike is going to be talking to us about treatment and post-fire assessment tools for management actions in the sagebrush ecosystem. And Mike will be presenting as well as Gayle Tyree today. So, Mike, I can see your slides.
Great. You can hear us okay?
I can hear you and I can see you both. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you for this opportunity to talk with you today and give you guys an update on the work we've been doing with assessment tools. We gave a presentation last year on this, and I'm excited to share sort of new developments, or we're excited to share new developments regarding developing a web application to make these tools we've been working on for nearly a decade now more available to managers. Let's see if I can get these suckers to advance. There we go. Thank you. So for funding acknowledgements, this current iteration of this research has been funded by the USGS EMA Land Management Research Program, as well as funding from the Bill ER Abandoned Mine Land Program for the web app development. We've had lots of previous funding and supporters, including the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the NRCS Soil Survey Division, as well as USGS Land Management Research Program. So with this research, we're really thinking about sort of how do we best close the adaptive management cycle and have sort of effective evaluation approaches for treatment assessments. So this diagram here from Williams and Shapiro, sort of outlining the adaptive management cycle, where you have a problem, you design your intervention, you implement your intervention, monitor, evaluate, adjust, and then repeat. As we saw with Matthew Rigge's presentation, we have amazing new fractional cover products that really help with that monitoring availability, especially back in time, ways which we didn't have before, in addition to the BLM AIM program and other field-based monitoring. With this work, we're really thinking about how we can best design evaluation tools that give you robust information about the effectiveness of the treatments. I think this is particularly important in the light of directional climate change and aridification, which we saw in the other presentations. So your treatment may feel like a failure, but if you don't have a comparison to an untreated area that's experiencing sort of this directional shift in climate, it might actually be an improvement, even though it's not improving linearly through time. And so the work we've done here began with really thinking about, from a soil and landscape perspective, how to best find really well-matched control sites for treatment areas. This work we did initially with oil and gas reclamation, where this sort of exercise is very common as part of the FAN process. And then we've expanded this thinking to broader landscapes and broader treatments, but really bringing in all the information we know about soil formation and topography, how that relates to governing where ecological sites are in the landscape, and trying to replicate that soil forming factor with this pixel matching algorithm. So we had a paper in Soil Science Society of America in 2016 where we first introduced this automated reference tool, where it really takes all the information we get from the best available soil maps and topographic maps to pick out well-matched controls. And then subsequently, we've been leveraging some of the information and thoughts out there from people analyzing natural experiments across disciplines, including the economic literature and healthcare literature, thinking about how they can best estimate a counterfactual. So what would have happened if I didn't do a treatment? And so this paper by Steve Fick and others in 2021 goes through that whole thought process. And so the web tool that Gayle is going to be talking about really has both of these features, where it does the matching of the pixels to find out well-matched controls as best we can, as well as implement these sort of counterfactual or the causal impact package to do a best estimate of the effectiveness of the treatment if you have an intervention date. We have published a number of papers using these tools over the years, beginning with oil and gas, doing analyzing reclamation outcomes from oil and gas, as well as livestock removal from some national parks here in southeastern Utah, and then doing analysis of pinyon juniper removal across the Colorado River Basin. And so here we're excited to really talk about the improvements we've made in the code, as well as Gayle's going to walk you through the web application and the sort of the functionality of it. big improvements to our disturbance automated reference toolset DART code have been expanding the covariates to work across CONUS. So previously we had done a lot of soil mapping on the Colorado River Basin. We used those soil maps, digital soil maps of the Colorado River Basin for the pixel matching. This new version of the code uses the soil maps from SOLAS, which are CONUS-wide 100-meter pixel resolution maps. And then we're also able to pull into the web application and the code the RCMAP products that Matthew Rigge talked about. This is the previous version, not the new version that's coming out, and that's with help from Michelle Jeffries at Fresk help us with that connection. And then we can also pull in the USDA Rangeland analysis platform data and biomass data from the RAP tool working with the USDA. And with this, I'm going to pass it off to Gayle to walk you through sort of the functionality of the WebDart tool.
Great, thanks, Mike. So welcome to WebDart, everybody. The first thing that you'll see when you open the app is the splash page giving an overview of the tool's purpose and kind of walking the user through it, as well as acknowledging our funding and partnership resources. And once you exit the splash page, you have these 3 steps that you go through to run the app. And the first step is to get your DART matches. And first of all, you need to define your target area as either a spatial point or a polygon. You can do that either by submitting coordinates in latitude and longitude to define a point, or just by clicking the map. And you can also upload a polygon file as well. And once you've pointed out your target area, you then define spatial parameters to define the radius of that target, particularly for point data, and then a search area radius where you will be looking for reference pixels that you will be using to understand the trajectory of that target area after the intervention. You also define a buffer around that target area to keep good separation between those and the reference pixels. You can also subsample your target pixels in case that you have a very large target area. And then you would also choose the number of reference pixels that you would be matching with each target pixel chosen. And once you've done that, you are ready to run DART. And once the tool has run, you're given this set of candidate reference pixels that's shown in the blue. So those are all the pixels inside that reference area that are considered for matching. And then depending on how many reference pixels you chose to match with each target pixel, you get this set of chosen reference pixels that is outlined in the different colors on top of the candidate reference pixels. And you're also informed of the strength of that match between each reference and target pixel. Once you've gotten your matches, you can export these data, which would include spatial information about the target and reference pixels, as well as the strength of the match and information about the variables used to match the pixels together. So moving on to step 2, when you get your landscape response and really start to understand the different trajectories between target and reference, you would first choose a response data set. And thanks to the folks at Fresk, we are able to utilize either RCMAP or as well as Rangeland analysis platform data. Once you've chosen your response data set, then you would choose a set of response variables available from that data set with which to compare trajectories between the target and the reference. Once you've done that, you can get your plots. And this shows time series of annual data that's averaged among the target pixels that's shown in red, and among reference pixels that's shown in gray to compare the trajectories of each response variable between the two. You're able to download these data either as a CSV file, and you can also download the plots in various formats. The last step is to run that synthetic control to get a counterfactual understanding of the size of the effect of that landscape intervention. And in this case, you would choose one response variable from that set you chose in step 2. And you would also define a treatment year in which the intervention took place. And once you run those those plots, then you would have a plot window and a report window. And in the plot pane, in the top panel, you have a solid black line showing the observed values of your target pixels. And then in the dashed blue line, in that top panel, you have your counterfactual. So a model showing like the yearly value as if that intervention had never happened. And in the second panel below, you just have the difference between the observed and the counterfactual values. We also get a report that's generated by the causal impact package that we're using to produce these plots. And once you have that counterfactual information, you can export the model summary as a CSV. You can also export those plots as well. All right, thank you. Back to you, Mike.
Thanks, Gayle. So we are in the final steps of approval with USGS to make the web tool available, publicly available. It should be very soon. We're also working on an R package and accompanying manuscript with additional validation data for the pixel matching process. And then we have several other collaborations underway working with partners, including looking at crested wheatgrass treatments in Eastern Oregon, treatment effectiveness analysis west-wide from the LTDL database, as well as livestock removal from the Hart Mountain Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge, working with Maddie Case there at Fresk. The QR code there and that website at the top is our project page where you can find links to all the papers we referenced. And this is also where we'll make the DART tool and the landing page for the DART tool available once it's gone through the final steps of IDPS. And with that, we'd be happy to take any questions if there's time, Leaf.
Janousek is going to be talking to us about some of the science being produced to support elk management, really reduce disease transmission and CWD risk. So Will is from our Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center. Will, I can see your slides.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So as Leif mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing in relation with the National Elk Refuge to inform their management and to hopefully reduce risk for chronic wasting disease. For those not familiar with the system, the National Elk Refuge is located here in northwestern Wyoming, just south of Grand Teton National Park. And on the refuge, that's home to the Jackson elk herd's portion of the wintering range. And supplemental feeding began there around 1910, just a few years prior to the creation of the refuge. And that feeding was started in part to reduce winter elk mortality, but also to reduce human elk conflict through hay depredation. Over the last century, that feeding has resulted in an increase in population as well as an increase in winter aggregation, which is cause for concern as it relates to the potential for disease transmission. When you have these high aggregations of elk, diseases like chronic wasting disease could be more easily transmitted between elk, but also through the environmental transmission component. And so chronic wasting disease was first observed in the Jackson elk herd in 2020. And the research we've been working on helps inform this next phase of the National Elk Refuge bison and management plan. So they're currently under the revision process of that plan, which will guide their management practices on the refuge here into the future. Give you a little different picture of what these aggregations on the refuge look like. This is an aerial image, a drone imagery of elk on feed lines. These vertical lines here are the feed lines that the elk are using. Densities on the National Elk Refuge can reach over 1,000 elk per square kilometer. That's 10 to 70 times higher than other populations where we've observed chronic wasting disease causing declines. And so we wanted to start to establish what factors drive these aggregations in addition to feeding, and start to understand in a more comprehensive approach how to approach management. And so we published a study in 2021 that compared supplemental feeding to several other factors. And it's probably not surprising that the feeding itself had the largest impact on increasing aggregation. But importantly, we also identified these other abiotic factors that can increase aggregation, things like changes in fractional snow cover, minimum temperature. And so understanding that component helps us guide these next steps that I'm going to talk about in terms of an adaptive management process to reduce the duration of feeding. So the National Elk Refuge has been working through a step-down plan to reduce the duration of feeding. The goals of this adaptive management plan is really to reduce the interaction of elk that can reduce direct transmission of diseases, but also reduce the aggregation and spread elk out across space, that thereby reducing the potential for environmental transmission or the contamination of the environment from pathogens like chronic wasting disease. The actions that have been taking place over the last several years has been the decrease in the duration of feeding, essentially 1 week less feeding per year over a 3-year period that we'll talk about in this analysis. So I'm going to briefly touch on a study that uses 6 years of GPS collar data. 2 years, 2017 and 2019, follow the baseline feeding strategy on the refuge. And this is a strategy where they use certain thresholds of forage availability to determine when to begin and end feeding. That's the typical process they've used over the last few decades. And so in 2018, though, there was no feeding on the refuge. That was a year of particularly low severity winter, and the conditions on the ground never met the thresholds to begin feeding. So we have a little bit of a natural experimental condition, even though that wasn't the purpose of that decision in the first place. And then there's 3 years of adaptive management. That's 2020 through 2022. Each year of that, the duration of feeding was shortened by 1 week, such as by 2022, the duration of feeding was 3 weeks shorter than in 2019. This data set, several thousand, 100,000 relocations, GPS data, and then from about 119 elk. The information that we use to kind of measure aggregation is something I'll refer to as proximity rates. This is really a measure of both time spent at close distances. So it's a time and space kind of measurement. We're looking over the periods of January 1st to May 1st of every year. This encompasses the annual feeding period, plus a little buffer on each end of the beginning and end of feeding. And so here's 2 years of the baseline feeding strategy. That's 2017 and 2019. On the x-axis, you can see the number of days that were fed that year. And the proximity rate, another way to think about that is if a proximity rate of about 0.2 would be essentially that any given pair of elk are spending about 20% of a day within a close distance of each other. So have potential to interact. For reference, here's a 2018 year where there was no feeding on the refuge. You can see that the proximity rate is lower as expected. And then here's the 3 years of adaptive management, each year reducing the duration of feeding by about a week. And if we squint or just look at the figure, we can see that there's a decline over that time period. And we've done statistical tests to show that these distributions are different. And at face value, that's encouraging to see that. But the bigger question really is, was the reduction in feeding duration responsible for that decline in aggregation, that decline in proximity? And so in addition to these just observational metrics, we also use a series of predictive modeling to predict what aggregation would have been if feeding had occurred under the baseline strategy in those weeks of reduced feeding. So first I'll show you 2020. The black lines represent what we observed from the GPS collar data, the observed proximity rate, the observed aggregation. And then the red line there is our predictions from our models that predicts what the feeding would have resulted in had it occurred in that 1 week of reduced feeding. The arrows point to where the real end of feeding in black occurred, and then where the hypothetical feeding ending would have occurred under the baseline strategy. And so from this year, we see that there's roughly a 54% reduction in the density during that 1 week of reduced feeding that results into a 54% overall change from the January 1st to May 1st period. Now, this has important disease implications. Really, if transmission of a disease is really high early spring, those reductions in duration of feeding could have large impacts. However, just short reductions in feeding, such as by 1 week, would have less impact if transmission of diseases are consistent across time. And that's something that's important for chronic wasting disease because we're still trying to understand the seasonality component to that disease transmission component. So then with 2021, it becomes a little bit more challenging to understand because we start to see in different situations, the models are predicting that the actual aggregation did not drop as much as would be suggested. And so we start to helps us understand the nuances that are behind changes in aggregation that's not just related to feeding. And so we start to see that predictive modeling indicates reducing feeding can be successful if it's aligned with the abiotic conditions, like matching the timing of spring melt, something that in 2020 was done very well. And then in 2021, the ending of feeding happened almost a month after the beginning of the melt period. And there's a lot of other factors that could drive increases in aggregation following the end of feeding. And we see this on the landscape, such as pre-migration staging events, uneven snowmelt across the landscape, creating patches of forage available and creating aggregation of elk that way. And also from habituation to worker activity, folks on the refuge have noted that elk cue in on the diesel machinery and that they use to feed. And so when they use diesel machinery after feeding, sometimes it can elicit a behavioral response in the elk, creating increased aggregations as well. So these analyses and this data that we've been working with, we've generated an R package to make the replication of these types of analyses more readily available and to reduce the coding requirements, to implement similar questions if you have data like GPS location data and you're interested in how aggregation of any wildlife species could be changing on a landscape. So that's available on the USGS GitLab website. There's also been several other projects that have taken place to help inform the bison elk management plan and the National Elk Group management strategies. One of those is a decision analysis to look at different management alternatives in the face of chronic wasting disease in the system. To quickly overview that, one big finding here is that comparing two different alternatives of continuing feeding and no feeding in the system when chronic wasting disease is prevalent, 20 years of simulations shows that after 20 years, no feeding alternative resulted in less chronic wasting disease and higher elk populations in that area. We also have other research coming out here. It's available for preprint and working through the publication process that really suggests that addressing human-elk conflict might be necessary to preserve long-distance migration in the Jackson elk herd. And that's important for how the aggregation plays out on the landscape as well. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on the USGS NOROC has a story map now that's live, and we'll put links in the chat related to this, where you can click through and view all these projects that I've talked about and see the documents and different graphics and things to kind of help learn about what we're doing with the system and the chronic wasting disease research related to that. Quick thanks to my co-authors here and acknowledge funding from the USGS Biothreats Program for chronic wasting disease research. The last few papers that we published, and then the one that will be coming out here shortly in the Wildlife Society Bulletin, reviewing our assessment of the adaptive management. My contact's there if you have any questions. Thanks.
All right. Thanks again to everybody who made the time to attend. Thanks again to our speakers, Matthew, Martin, Shawn, Gregor, Alice, Will, Mike, Gayle. Really appreciate the time. And again, just really trying to highlight these partnerships. As you've heard, a lot of partnerships with resource management agencies, state, federal, and really, again, all of our talks today were just great examples of building upon previous science, integrating existing science together to come to some good information to help inform adaptive management. So thank you all. We look forward to doing these again.